Before I get started, if you've not watched the first devlog for an elaborate history of chess, then please do go watch that first to get a bit of a background on the project so far. If that's not you and you're all up to date, then we'll get on to devlog 2. The plan was crafting an inventory, but what people want to know about is how the game doesn't become overwhelming too quickly, so let's talk about that first. Back in 1990, Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, and excuse me if I pronounced that wrong, wrote about the theory of flow, where skill and challenge are mapped against each other, and when someone is perfectly balanced between them, they enter the flow state. Too hard for how unskilled or underpowered the player is and a game becomes annoying. Too easy for how skilled the player is, or how overpowered they are, and the game becomes boring. I mention the power level of the player because, sure, the player is going to get more skilled as they play the game, but we can definitely do things to make sure that their power over what happens is also balanced with how hard the game is. So the first major step towards having a balance over the course of the game between how many things you need to take care of at once and how easy it is to take control over them was having queued moves. Queued moves allow you to just drag a piece in a direction and it will figure out the best path to get there. This uses a fun version of A-star pathfinding that I wrote so that it cares about what the movement pattern of the piece is. For those who don't know, normal A-star pathfinding is essentially a loop of looking at what steps you have available, choosing the best one, and then seeing what available moves there are from that point, as well as all the unvisited possible moves that you had from earlier steps. Once you find the goal, you just trace back through the steps that you took to get to that point. The difference with my system, which I don't think makes it not A-star, it's just not what you'd usually see, is that when considering what steps are available from a given point, I just use the movement pattern available to that particular piece. This means that dragging a knight across big gaps actually makes use of the L-shaped movement pattern you'd expect. I also wanted the ease of controlling your pieces to map fairly evenly to how many pieces you have, and the way I wanted to do that was by allowing you to pre-plan as many moves for your pieces as your kingdom level. Kingdom level is something that will be determined by how much of the game you've played, and so should fairly evenly map onto how many pieces you have, although it won't be exact. But I think that's fine. I'll talk more in the future about how kingdom level is going to work. The next thing that makes the game easier to play in general is a handful of the piece abilities that I talked about last video. The first most notable one is auto movement. Auto movement is different for all pieces that have it, and so far that's pawns and knights and some new pieces that you'll be able to get much later in the game, miners and lumberjacks. These are all the pieces you're going to probably want a lot of, and auto movement's different for each of them because they all do different things. Pawns move onto crops if they can find them, or plant new crops in places that don't if they can't, with a small chance each movement to spread the crops further. Knights will move to attack any enemies on the board, but only if there are any. Miners will seek out stone to mine, and lumberjacks will seek out trees to chop down. Auto movement was a bit too good when I first added it, so I added a secondary ring around the bottom of each piece that acts almost as a thinking timer, so pieces that have any sort of auto action will need to both wait for their normal timer and their thinking timer to take an auto action. Pieces will only move automatically if they're not currently selected, so pieces won't start moving when you're trying to move them. They also won't attack their own team, so you can trap some pawns in a little area with some castles or other pieces to make a little farm, maybe with a bishop to make them work faster. By this point I'd added experience points and levels for pieces, which pawns would gain for farming, knights would gain by defeating enemies, that sort of thing. So I made some piece abilities only available to a piece when they'd reached a certain level. That way pawns and knights need to be leveled up by the player before they can actually do it on their own, so you kind of have to train them to do their job. I'm also playing about with a new ability at the minute called leadership. The player can drag any piece onto another piece that has leadership, and it will then follow that piece as well as it can. I'm also wanting to use this system for some enemies or maybe neutral team pieces that follow each other in the future, like a caravan of camels or something like that. But this means that you can move entire groups of pieces by just moving one piece, which is a lot easier. But it definitely needs some testing to see what the limitations of it should be, and what pieces actually should get it. Before the idea of queued moves, and especially before auto movement, we played about with the idea of having repeated moves or patrol areas, and that might be something we explore again in the future, but for now we're more than happy with auto movement, and the other bits and pieces in place to keep the game state a little easier to control. I should probably still cover crafting an inventory to stay on track. So after adding the ability for pawns to farm land in the last episode, I added a panel on the right of the screen with a scroll view that could act as an inventory. The inventory gets populated with item stacks that keep track of how many of a particular item type there is, so an inventory. This meant I could do things like allow the player to pick up an item of that type if the mouse downed on an item stack, and then when they dropped the item it would pop back into the inventory. I originally had items move from the world to the right hand side of the screen where the inventory was, like they were being pulled in, but I realised as the game got bigger there would be so many items flying around and it would just become a living hell. Now that the player could pick up and move around items, I made some little panels that I called item holders, which were perfect for individual item slots. So if you drop an item on them, it stays there instead of going back into the inventory. When an item holder has an item, I can test what the item is, change it, destroy it, the sort of thing that a crafting system would need to do. And so was born the crafter. The crafter allows you to turn two items into one more useful item. I wanted to use the crafter as a way to make some of the units in the game, so I made a type of item called a piece item that when released wouldn't go into the inventory and would instead spawn a piece of the appropriate type at the nearest point in the game world where it was dropped. To test this, I made it so that crafting together two stones made a castle. This immediately felt too easy to do, so I gave it another layer, meaning you needed to craft 2 stone into a brick and then 2 brick into a castle, which is still pretty economical for a castle to be honest. As I mentioned, pieces now had levels, and I wrote some code to allow for different images to be used for the pieces as they level up, which I might make more use of in the future. But for now the main use is having the castle get taller over time. So you could now craft a tiny little paddling pool made out of bricks, and that could be crafted with more bricks to level it up, which was an upsetting amount of code for what it was, but it's fine, it works. I also made it so that when a piece is dragged over the crafter, they turn into a piece item, and that item remembers what the position of the piece was. So if I wanted to upgrade a castle that's already on the board, it goes back to where it was before it was upgraded. This also meant that I could do some pretty questionable and maybe not very PG things like crafting any 2 pieces together, returning them to the board and popping a new pawn item into the crafter output, just like in real life. So there was now a way to increase the population and a way to upgrade pieces. Alongside upgrading castles to higher level castles, I also made some recipes for all the normal chess pieces, which I've played about with a lot since then. Most notably though, you need iron for knights, gold for bishops, a crown for a king, that sort of stuff. I wanted the crafter to be easy to update, so I made all the crafting combinations load in from a JSON file, which is a type of file with format that makes it easy to read into the system, which turned out to be really good for wanting to do some quick tests. I made it so that the crafter had a bit of a load time, which I didn't want to be too punishing, so it's fairly quick, but it does mean that you'll need to be a tiny bit more careful about what you're crafting and when. To get some of the items you'd need to upgrade your pieces, such as iron and gold, I added some more enemies into the game. Golems are little rocky guys that drop stone and little bits of iron, and they start spawning fairly early game. They've taken the place of spiders for now and have the single diagonal movement pattern that spiders had. I'm sure I'll find a place for spiders later though. A little later into the game, zombies start spawning and they drop gold for some reason. Zombies essentially mirror pawn movement, and I made them look a little bit like zombified pawns to make that clearer. Now that I had some more enemies, it did become fairly clear though that it wasn't very easy to see what movement patterns they had. Unlike the zombie, they weren't all one-to-one mappings with normal chess pieces, so I added a little red highlight to an enemy's possible moves if you mouse over them, which is really useful. I still have a lot more to talk about, but I'll leave it at that for now. The game is live on Steam and ready to wishlist right now, so please do head over there if you're interested, and join the Iteration Games Discord, follow us on Twitter, all of the usual stuff if you want to keep up to date with development. Apart from that, thank you for watching, subscribe, like, do all the good things, and I will see you next time.